You believed medicine was built on truth. You trusted the doctor's uniform, the prescription pad, and the reassuring voice that told you your pain had a name and a chemical fix. You didn't question because questioning felt like suspicion, and suspicion felt dangerous when you were already drowning. You saw the commercials, the brain diagrams with arrows pointing at pathways, the neat explanation that your sadness was just low serotonin, fixable with a pill the same way insulin fixes diabetes. You watched doctors nod with certainty. You read articles that spoke of chemical imbalances like proven fact, and you saw the prescription numbers climb into the tens of millions. You felt relief, not because the pills always worked, but because the story made sense. Your suffering had a mechanical cause. There was nothing wrong with your life, your choices, or your relationships. Just your brain chemistry. Wrong amounts in the wrong places. You took the pills, and you waited for the rebalancing. You told yourself the side effects were temporary, the sexual dysfunction would pass, and the emotional flattening was just adjustment. When the first medication failed, you tried another. When that one failed, you tried a combination. You didn't blame the theory. You blamed your brain for being more broken than average. But here's what they knew in the 1990s, what they printed in their own internal documents, and what their researchers said in private meetings. There was never any evidence. The chemical imbalance theory was a marketing story, not a medical discovery. No test has ever measured serotonin levels in a living human brain and correlated them with depression. No study has ever shown that depressed people have lower serotonin than non-depressed people. The theory was reverse engineered from the drugs, not the other way around. They have pills that seem to affect serotonin, so they built a disease model around the pills they wanted to sell. The FDA, the researchers, and the pharmaceutical executives, they all knew. They ran studies that showed their drugs barely outperformed placebos, and they published only the positive trials and buried the rest. They paid doctors to give lectures. They funded patient advocacy groups. They wrote the diagnostic criteria that expanded the definition of depression to include normal grief, stress, and disappointment. They turned ordinary human suffering into a medical deficiency that required their product. And when scientists started saying publicly that the chemical imbalance theory was unsupported, they didn't confront the criticism. They just marketed harder. You accepted this because you needed hope, and hope came packaged as science. You didn't investigate because investigating felt like betraying your own recovery. If you admitted the theory was false, you'd have to admit you'd been managing your pain with a story instead of a cure. You'd have to face the possibility that your suffering was more complex than a simple chemical equation, that maybe your life circumstances, your relationships, your unprocessed trauma actually mattered more than a neurotransmitter count that was never measured in the first place. This is what mislabeling does. You called your acceptance of the chemical imbalance theory trusting science. You called your willingness to take medications without questioning their basis being responsible about mental health. You called your reluctance to challenge your doctor respecting expertise. But what you actually did was outsource your suffering to a system that profits from your belief in your own biological deficiency. You made yourself smaller by accepting that your sadness was a malfunction instead of a response. You traded the harder work of examining your life for a simple narrative that you just needed the right chemical adjustment. And the story felt good. The chemical imbalance theory gave you permission to stay stuck while feeling like you were getting help. Turning, "I need to change my life," into, "I need to change my prescription," became your primary strategy. But the people prescribing these pills were not scientists evaluating evidence. They were tools of pharmaceutical sales. Pharmaceutical reps visited your doctor's office weekly with packaged lunches, branded pens, and studies designed to sell. Your doctor attended conferences in resort cities, all expenses paid by companies whose drugs they'd prescribe Monday morning. They received payments labeled consulting fees and speaker honorariums that were really just compensation for prescription volume. The top prescribers got invited to advisory boards, got their names on ghost-written papers, and got flown to exclusive dinners where they networked with other high prescribers. Your doctor wrote your prescription in 15 minutes, But that prescription was the end result of a 10-year marketing campaign that started in medical school. The psychiatry textbooks were funded by drug companies. The diagnostic manual your symptoms were checked against was written by a panel where 69% had financial ties to pharmaceutical companies. Your doctor believed they were practicing medicine. They were performing marketing, and they'd been trained not to see the difference. This isn't about individual corruption. Most doctors genuinely wanted to help you, but they existed inside a system where helping you and selling you had been deliberately made indistinguishable. The education looked like science. The marketing looked like education. The financial bribes were buried in professional development budgets and research grants. Without your knowledge, your doctor delivered pills like a distribution channel, and you were treated not as a person, but as a patient population. Once major depressive disorder entered your medical record, systems you never see started making calculations about you. Your health insurance premiums went up, not dramatically enough to notice in a single year, but compounding quietly every renewal period. The predictive algorithms flagged you as higher cost, higher risk, and more likely to need ongoing treatment. When you applied for life insurance, the underwriters saw psychiatric medication and moved you into a different risk category. Your rates went higher, or your application got delayed for additional medical reviews. Sometimes it got denied outright with vague language about pre-existing conditions and risk assessment. Your employer's HR system tracked your insurance claims. They didn't see your specific diagnosis because of privacy laws, but they saw the costs. They saw ongoing psychiatric care, monthly prescriptions, and regular doctor visits. When the company evaluated healthcare expenses by department, you were marked as expensive. You apply for a mortgage or a business loan, and the bank's scoring system sees your prescription history through the Medical Information Bureau that tracks insurance claims. The system didn't reject you. It just adjusted your interest rate upward by 0.5 percentage point. The loan officer couldn't tell you why, because they didn't know. The algorithm had flagged you as statistically more likely to have income disruptions, more likely to default. Your depression became a number in a risk model, and that number cost you thousands of dollars over the life of the loan. You never knew this was happening because nobody told you. The system just quietly made you more expensive to insure and costlier to lend to. When you tried to buy disability insurance, the application asked about mental health treatment. You answered honestly because lying would void the policy. The system either refused to cover mental health or charged you twice as much. You were paying extra for the same safety as everyone else, but the holes in your protection were carved right where you were weakest. The diagnosis that was supposed to help you access treatment became the reason you couldn't access protection. This is the institutional adjustment nobody explains when they hand you the prescription. You don't just become a patient. You become a data point that makes you more expensive and less desirable to every system that manages risk for profit. Your depression stops being a private medical matter and becomes a permanent mark in databases that determine your access to money, jobs, and security. And these systems don't care whether the chemical imbalance claim was true. They only care that you have a psychiatric diagnosis on file, and psychiatric diagnoses correlate with costs they don't want to absorb. But here's the mechanism working underneath. Every month you remain under prescription and keep that diagnosis active. You generate more data points that make you more expensive to insure and less attractive to employ. The longer your treatment history, the worse your risk profile becomes. Year 3 of continuous treatment looks worse to an algorithm than year 1. Year 10 looks worse than year 3. You think you're managing a chronic condition responsibly. The systems evaluating you think you're an escalating liability. And because these calculations happen in databases and algorithms you never see, you can't argue that you're high functioning or that your medication works. The model doesn't care about your individual circumstances. It only cares about population-level correlations between psychiatric diagnoses and financial outcomes. You get sorted into a category, and that category determines your access to resources. The diagnosis that gave you a medical explanation for your pain simultaneously locked you into an economic classification that makes everything harder and more expensive. What gets destroyed in this process is your ability to start over. The diagnosis becomes a permanent record that follows you through every system that gates access to stability. You can't just decide to stop treatment and erase the history. The insurance companies, the employers, the lenders all have your data. Even if you quit medication today, you'd still be flagged as someone with a psychiatric history. The mark doesn't fade. It compounds. Every year you were treated becomes another year that makes you look riskier to the system's allocating opportunity. This is what you lose by accepting the false theory and staying inside the treatment system it created. Not just years on medication that might not work the way you were told. Not just the opportunity cost of not examining your actual life circumstances. You lose the neutral starting position. You become someone the economic system has classified as damaged, and that classification determines what you can access, what you pay, and what opportunities you're quietly denied. The chemical imbalance theory didn't just medicalize your suffering. It turned your suffering into a financial liability that other people's systems learned to avoid. The medication itself creates the track record that makes you harder to insure and employ. Every refill, every doctor visit, every claim submitted generates another data point in your file. You think you're being responsible by staying in treatment. What you're actually doing is building a case that makes you look like an escalating risk to every institution that profits from avoiding people like you. And nobody tells you this is happening because the systems doing the sorting don't announce their criteria. They just quietly adjust your rates, pass over your applications, and move you down the list. The real cost isn't that big pharma lied about serotonin. The cost is that their lie created a diagnostic category that economic systems learned to penalize. You accepted the diagnosis because it explained your pain. What you didn't know was that accepting the diagnosis meant accepting a classification that would follow you through every institution that gates access to money, work, and security. You traded understanding for accessibility, and the trade was permanent. Now you're years into treatment for a chemical imbalance that never existed, taking pills under a theory that was always false, building a medical history that makes you more expensive to insure and less desirable to employ. You've been classified as a risk category by systems you can't see and can't challenge. The diagnosis that was supposed to help you became the thing that sorted you into the expensive, unreliable, avoid when possible category in every database that determines who gets access to what. Every year you stay in treatment, the classification becomes more entrenched. The job you can't leave because you need the health insurance becomes the job you can't get promoted from because your insurance costs make you expensive. The insurance you can't drop because you need it to afford medication becomes more expensive every year because your ongoing treatment proves you're a bad risk. The mortgage you're paying higher rates on because of your diagnosis forces you to keep working the job that makes you depressed enough to need the medication that justified the higher rates. Every piece locks you into the next piece, and the system just keeps extracting more from you while giving you less. You know something is wrong. You felt it every time you got passed over for a promotion you were qualified for, every time your insurance premiums went up for no clear reason, every time a loan application took longer than it should have. You thought it was bad luck or coincidence. It was systems making calculations about you based on data you generated by trying to get help. The help became the reason you needed more help, and the systems profiting from both just kept adjusting their models to extract more while protecting themselves from people like you. The chemical imbalance theory gave you a story that made suffering medical and manageable. What it actually did was create a classification system that made you more expensive and less desirable to every institution that allocates access to stability. You're not just on medication. You're categorized and permanently marked in databases that determine what you can access and what you have to pay. And the mark doesn't fade when you realize the theory was false. The damage is already recorded, already being used against you in decisions you'll never see being made.